Wake the fuck up, samurai. We have a city to burn.
So, Cyberpunk 2077, let's talk about it. AKA the game where I spent over 30 hours trying to earn the validation and respect and friendship of Johnny Silverhand. Who wouldn't want to be friends with Keanu Reeves? I want to make it clear at the beginning of this video that my aim here is not to say whether Cyberpunk 2077 is a bad or a good game in terms of its narrative, because liking stories is subjective. You can watch something and it can be technically good and you can hate it. Vice versa, it could be technically bad and you love it. So I don't really want to talk about that. I want to talk about the narrative itself, how things worked well, how things didn't work well. I don't want to touch on the performance aspect of the game, so I'm not going to be talking about bugs, but instead look at the core of the game. Do know though that I played it on PS4 and that the recordings that I have are from my gameplay on my PS4. So if they look a little off, that's why. Also, spoilers, please don't watch this if you haven't finished Cyberpunk 2077 or intend to finish Cyberpunk 2077. There's a lot of spoilers in here. I'm just going to talk about it. I think it's really important to define the genre that Cyberpunk 2077 is coming into, which is obviously cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is defined by Merriam-Webster as science fiction dealing with future societies dominated by computer technology. So basically in Cyberpunk, you always have this oppressive force, usually in the form of corporations, that use technology to oppress the less powerful and disenfranchise and push the limits of science and like what it means to be human, just the limits of technology.
The one about how if I've invented a machine with consciousness, I'm not a man, I'm God.
I don't think that's exactly what
I just thought, fuck, man, that is so good.
You know, this can be seen in really popular cyberpunk stories and media narratives like Blade Runner, where you have replicants who want to be free living humans and they're hunted down by the main character, Deckard, who is a Blade Runner, to be retired. We can see it in the Deus Ex series, which shows us like the repercussions of having expensive technologies without the means of paying for like the accompanying drugs, so people end up dying, or how easy it is for these people who are very powerful to corrupt through the use of technology. But even in medias like Westworld or Ex Machina, both force us to question what it means to be human and how far technology can go and what is acceptable for us to create as people. Cyberpunk is this like genre that forces readers to consider different alternatives. You're supposed to question authority, you're supposed to question technology, you're supposed to question the world around you, if not outright despise it. Cyberpunk narratives are usually like bleak, dark. They rarely, if ever, have what we conventionally would call a happy ending. Usually the endings are full of the same bleak darkness that it pervades throughout the rest of the narrative. Cyberpunk 2077 really wants to convey these sentiments, you can tell throughout the narrative, but it seems like it doesn't ever know properly how to do it. You see glimpses of it occasionally, but even towards the end of the game, we don't ever really get the punch to your gut, what is real, what is fake, what is the meaning of all this anyways, feeling that comes with these other stories.
Like tears in rain.
But what I want to do now is just go back to talk about the whole narrative of the game, talk about where it starts, how it ends, the middle, everything fun. So at the beginning of the game, you get to pick a life path. There are 3 life paths in the game: Corpo, Nomad, and Street Kid. Honestly, the life path doesn't matter past the first 30 minutes of the game. It only ever really comes into play in small dialogue choices, which never really actually affect the narrative. So basically you have the 3 intros. In the Nomad intro, you're a nomad whose family is in pieces. You're looking to start a new life in Night City. You get a job from Jackie delivering contraband over the border. There's an emphasis on the fact that your character V is like an unwanted outsider. You see it in the border control and the way they treat you, the way they double cross you. But then you end up forming a friendship with Jackie, decide to sell the cargo together, and begins the start of the game. In the Corpo intro, V is an Arasaka employee who works in counterintelligence. They have to head to an office for their boss, Jenkins, who, frustrated with a colleague, orders V to make a hit on his rival. After this meeting, V travels to Lizzie's to meet Jackie, only to be approached by an Arasaka agent, stripped of all of their corporate standing and job lifestyle, and ends up with Jackie running on the streets. Street Kid intro starts with V at a bar. V talks to the bartender, finds out that the bartender owes a lot of money to a man named Kirk. In an effort to settle the debt, V takes on a job where they have to steal a very expensive car. The job goes wrong. Jackie interrupts in the job, which is how we meet him. After being let go, V and Jackie become friends. Like I said, regardless of how you start the game, you get to the same point where you and Jackie are now friends, and you decide to go out into Night City and become legends together. From a narrative standpoint, Act 1 serves as a way to introduce the viewer to the world of Night City. We need to learn the lore, we get interactions through Jackie and others that teach us about this world, about what Night City is like. We get to experience it for the first time. In addition, it's also a way of us cementing our friendship with Jackie as a character. The game wants you to become attached to Jackie like V is attached to Jackie, so that way at the end of the heist mission we feel for him as V does. Unfortunately, because of the way the narrative is set up, it doesn't really enable the viewer to do this, and it's almost impossible with the structure of the beginning of the game to achieve this. Most of the interactions that we have with Jackie in the beginning of the game are through jobs, and while they do give us some reflection of the friendship that both V and Jackie have with each other, we never really get that moment, the touching moment where we really feel the bond between these two characters. Instead, we get this montage of their first year of friendship together, where we get these quick paced clips that give us an idea that Jackie is our closest friend. Look at us all going hanging out together, doing jobs, having parties, living our best lives. I'm personally not a fan of montages in stories. Usually they're like a cheap and lazy way for someone telling a story to circumnavigate telling the story, unless they have an actual real purpose outside of, wow, watch these people do things together because they're really good friends. They're usually just a lazy trick used by people to convey something. And that's really what the whole beginning of the game felt like. Regardless of which life path you choose, it doesn't matter because you're a street kid by the time the game starts. The nomad lifestyle maybe makes a little sense. You've come to the city to find a new life. You've already deserted this nomadic lifestyle. Yeah, you're a street kid now. Or the Corpo life path, which makes even less sense. You're telling me an Arasaka employee who worked in counter intel is left alone after being stripped of the job title? Really? Regardless, you come to the heist, which is predictably a job gone wrong, and the inciting incident of the narrative, of the core narrative of the game. This is where it really starts. You are tasked with stealing a chip from Arasaka, so you break into this real fancy hotel. You witness the murder of Saburo Arasaka, the head of Arasaka, by his own son, Yorinobu Arasaka, and then Jackie and V basically begin a fight for their life to escape the hotel with the chip that they've been given a job to steal. Jackie doesn't survive, but V does by inserting the chip into their head, wherein we come to find out that Johnny Silverhand's enneagram, or personality construct, is embedded in the chip, and it starts to begin to override V's personality. So this is the beginning of the real story of the game. This is also the first time in the story where we get the first real cyberpunk theme. We see this power struggle between Yorinobu and Saburo, and we see that he's willing to sacrifice family for power. So this is a really important theme in Cyberpunk, is being willing to sacrifice anything for power, especially in terms of corporations. It's also the first time we find out that Mikoshi really exists, though we don't really know what it is at that point. But we find out that Johnny Silverhand, his data personality, was put into this thing called Mikoshi, which is basically a prison for personality construct. If you have enough money, you can pay to have your personality construct saved so that you can be brought back in a different body. But they used other people's unwillingly to see if it would work. So that's how Johnny became part of it. Regardless of what happens at this point, Jackie dies. V returns to Dex, the person who gave them the job in the first place. Dex goes back on his word, thinking that you have killed Saburo, doesn't want to be involved in it, ends up shooting V, leaves you in a landfill for dead. So you technically die at this point, which is why the chip saves you. It overrides V's personality basically and starts the process of taking over their body. We get the first glimpse of Johnny. He is basically just not a good guy and he hates Arasaka. That's all we learn about him really in these parts of the game, is that he's against the corporation, he's against Arasaka, and he sucks as a person. We're dragged out of the landfill right after this by Takamura, who is Saburo Arasaka's former bodyguard. And then while transporting V back to Night City, Takamura and V are attacked by Arasaka assassins, which basically ends up alienating Takamura from the corporate lifestyle and makes him an ally in our fight against the chip in our head. Basically, he can help us come up with a solution. This whole part of the narrative is when V comes to learn the truth about the chip in their head and the consequences of what will happen if they don't remove it, and so starts the narrative of the game. Get the chip out of V's head or else V will die. After this is when the narrative begins to lull a bit. Basically, our mission, find a way to remove the chip in any means possible, and the game gives us several different pathways to do so. You know, you have missions with Takamura, who's convinced he can get V to tell his corpo friends the truth and that they'll believe V, and we're encouraged to help him contact Hanako to tell her the truth so that Takamura can avenge the death of Saburo, and also, in exchange, we get the chip removed from our brain. Another lead is we can pursue the lead of Evelyn, who's the enigmatic doll in the beginning who gives us the job, who's mysteriously gone missing after this job. Once we realize that she's basically been sold on the black market, we wind up pursuing a group called the Voodoo Boys, who are a gang on the outskirts of town that nobody wants to deal with, in exchange for doing them a job in which they try to betray you, or you can betray them. We find out that they want to contact Alt, who is the ex-girlfriend and now AI of Johnny Silverhand, who is in the cyberspace beyond a thing called the Black Wall, which is where rogue AI live, apparently. Through this mission, we're able to find Alt on the other side of the Black Wall, and Alt can help us break into Mikoshi, but we have to break into Arasaka to be able to get into Mikoshi. And once we can get in there, we can separate Johnny and V's personalities, go back to life as it is. Through this, we also end up meeting Panem, who helps us kidnap Hellman, who is the creator of Soul Killer, which is what it is called. Turns out he doesn't actually know how to help us at all, so he's kind of useless in the story and is just another corpo hack that nobody wants to deal with. A lot of this narrative part of the story is like allowing the storytellers to take us through the different parts of this universe and explain more lore to us. Like, hey, look at this place called Pacifica. Look at this other part of the map. Look at this part of the map. All while progressing through the monotonous part of the core story, which is basically find a cure and someone help us through whatever means necessary. We'll pursue any lead, which is what this part of the game is. This section of the narrative also allows us to learn more about Johnny as a character. We see through flashbacks how badly he treated all the people he cared about.
Not another goddamn word, okay? Just shut up. For once.
And he hangs around V incessantly throughout the game, always butting in and making them see or do things in the way that he wants them to. And at the end of all this, V is really only left with two options. Somehow break into Arasaka, a giant corporation that practically owns Night City, to find Mikoshi to let a rogue AI separate them from Johnny, or trust Hanako Arasaka to help you remove the chip from your brain. For somewhat obvious reasons, Johnny doesn't trust Hanako and doesn't think you should sell your soul to the corporation and advocates that you break into Arasaka yourself. But regardless of your choice, this initiates the 7 different endings to the game, 3 of which resemble the life paths from the beginning of the game, and 1 which is a secret extra fun ending. In the corpo ending of the game, you trust Hanako Arasaka and you agree to testify against her brother in front of the board of Arasaka. Instead, what happens is you end up murdering a ton of Arasaka's men for Hanako to help her escape from the house she is being kept hostage in, before Yorinobu ends up killing half of the board, tries to kill Hanako, and then you're sent to find him by Hanako, kill all of his men. In this ending, once you're done doing this, Hanako agrees to take the chip out of your head, and when you meet Johnny in cyberspace. He no longer respects you. He thinks you sold your soul to the corporation. You've lost everything that made you interesting as a person. V ends up waking up after the surgery in an orbital station where, having withstood the surgery, they end up losing their mind with consistent testing with no way of getting out, it seems like, for a long time. At the end of this testing, it come to find out they are dying. There's no way to cure them. You can either return to Earth knowing that you will die in a few months, or be a part of the Save Your Soul program, which is the program that got you into this mess in the first place. It is revealed, like at the end of the game, that Saburo Arasaka had his consciousness saved into Mikoshi, and he takes over his son Yorinobu's body. So in the end, you do nothing but help the corporation. You do nothing for anyone. You kind of just sell your soul, and then you die, or you go and be a part of the problem in the first place, not knowing when you're going to be put back into your body. So not a good ending. There's another ending with Panem where you can recruit the help of the nomads to help you break into Arasaka and find Mikoshi as V. You don't let Johnny take over. Several members of the clan die, including Saul, who had his head stomped in by Adam Smasher, only to find out in the end that V can be put back into their body but only has a few months left to live, or Johnny can take over the body. V chooses to go back. They flee with Panem over the border to start a new life outside of Night City with what remaining time they have left. Or if you let Johnny take over, Johnny leaves all your acquaintances behind without a word and leaves Night City. This ending is frustrating for a number of reasons, though it is arguably the happiest ending when you leave with Panem, but in that the nomads die for no reason because you're just gonna die anyway, which doesn't really make any sense. The last ending of the game is somewhat similar to the Nomad ending, but instead you let Johnny take over your body and he recruits the help of Rogue to break into the Arasaka building to find Mikoshi. Rogue in this ending dies similarly to how Saul dies at the hands of Adam Smasher, but it ends up with the same result. Either V can return to their body with a few months left to live, or Johnny can take over. And the only difference in this situation is that when you go into the cyberspace, you're actually playing Johnny, not V, so you see your character's own reactions and see the bond that these two have made throughout their time together. At the end of this story, if V takes over, V wakes up in a giant house, like a giant complex nice apartment in Night City, and it ends with V taking a job against Arasaka as a final, what seems to be like gut punch to both Arasaka for V and Johnny. Same thing, you can let Johnny return to the body. Johnny leaves Night City is essentially the deal. There are two more endings. One of them, you can choose to storm Arasaka with Johnny yourself if Johnny considers you a friend. If you make one dialogue choice in the entire game, if you make it wrong, you cannot get this ending, as I learned. But you storm Arasaka with Johnny yourself. Same ending as the Street Kid ending with Rogue. You become a big shot or Johnny takes over your body. The only other ending that I've seen is you can commit suicide in the game, decide that it's not worth putting any of your friends' lives at risk, end it. It's a really sad, depressing ending to the game. Each of these different endings, I think, has a really dark and empty feeling that comes with the genre of cyberpunk, except for maybe the Panem ending is the only happy ending when you run off with Panem. But in each of these respective endings, you kind of give up something. In the Corpo ending, you've betrayed Johnny. You've given up everything just to let the corporation win in the end and get nothing out of it. In the Street Kid ending, when you become a big shot at the end, you make it to the big leagues like you and Jackie said you always would, but there's a sort of empty feeling. V isn't happy in this ending. V's gonna die anyway, but there's really such a emptiness to this ending. There's no fulfillment. It's what was this all for in the end? The biggest thing with this story is that there is no final gut punch at the end of this story. There's no bigger picture that we're seeing in the story. It seems like the game scrapes at the edge of this feeling constantly, but never fully achieves it. They never push it far enough. The closest you get to seeing this is really in the Corpo ending. In the Corpo ending, you feel like you've sold your soul for no reason, so it doesn't fit with the way you might want to play your character V. I know I played a Street Kid V, and my Street Kid V would never have picked the Corpo ending. Even when I was doing it just to play through, it felt like a betrayal of everything that my character was. And this is emphasized through your relationship with Johnny and Misty in that ending. Neither of them trust you. Neither of them want anything to do with you because you've betrayed everything that meant something in the story. But there's no bigger picture. In the end, we're not left thinking, oh, there's all these souls in Mikoshi that are being tied up, whatever. We destroy it. But it feels like a very secondary thing to what V and Johnny have going on, which I guess is the main drive of the story. But because there's not a lot of development to V and Johnny's relationship in the course of the story, he's a very inconsistently written character. I felt myself constantly going back and forth between liking him and disliking him.
Halt, this is V. You need to save her life.
You're a dirt girl from Haywood who found the guts to walk a few extra blocks from home. But turned out the best you can do is chase scabs for Annie's.
You're a dick, you know.
And you're a cunt. Maybe we'll fit together after all.
Because there are some moments where he's a really good voice in your head who helps you along with the story. But then there are other times where he's extremely misogynistic. He just flip-flops between the two. Towards the end of the game, he becomes more consistent in his friendship with V, seems to begin to trust V more if you've let Johnny do things, which I feel the story wants you to do. But there's still an inconsistency to their friendship. I think that's why at the end of the game, even though it is sad to see Johnny leave V, it's not as sad as it could have been. It's like in the beginning with Jackie. There just needed to be more substance in the middle for us to get to know Johnny better, for us to encourage us to want to be with Johnny, to want to go along with what Johnny says through character development. But it's not really ever put in place until the end of the game, and at which point it's too late. You just don't feel as much as you could have felt for that character. At the end of this, since I've just talked through the narrative, what I want to do is talk about my critiques and high points of the narrative, things that I really liked about the game, things that I wouldn't change, things that I would definitely change. So I'm going to start with the critiques because we want to end on a high note. The first big critique I have of the game is Arasaka's involvement in the story. You have this big, powerful corporation which made me think, you know, when you watch Blade Runner, you have Tyrell Corp. When you play the Deus Ex games, you have the Illuminati, which is comprised of all these giant corporations who have like not good ideals. And that's what Arasaka is supposed to be in this game. But it doesn't really live up to the lore that is established by the game. Like at the beginning of the game, why are you never once pursued again after helping Takamura escape in the beginning? They're out to kill you. The assassins are out to kill you and out to kill Takamura to make it better, but we never once see them again in the narrative. Even though this is a powerful company that controls Night City, for some reason they have no interest in you as a character. And even if Yorinobu is set on changing how the company is and maintaining power, wouldn't he want to apprehend the person running around who's accused of killing his father, and two, who has the chip in their head from their company and has a lot of company secrets? That would be bad to be having running around on the streets of Night City. Even after the mission with Takamura, where you can get the support of Hanako, she's not the whole corporation. Why isn't V being chased? Why does no one in Arasaka care about what V is doing, even though V is complicating things in every sort of aspect? Arasaka was like really underused and underutilized in the game. Having more involvement in the core narrative of the story rather than just being this distant threat or something that Johnny hated would have made the corporation equals bad theme of Cyberpunk and of the Cyberpunk game itself more apparent. It would have made it more powerful. We would have felt more conflicted, I feel like, at the end if you had picked the Corpo ending, or you would have felt angrier if you had picked the Rogue or the Panem ending. Like, yeah, I want to stick it to the man, which I would want to do anyway, but like also it just would have been emphasized if they had used Arasaka better as a giant corporate monolith in the game. The whole middle section of the game is really anticlimactic, which is okay because the middle section of your narrative can be the progression, the climbing action towards the goal, but it's just not done well. You don't feel any connection to the story. There's just no substance really to the middle part of the game. It doesn't feel like you're doing anything outside of this main mission that's important or means anything. Another big gripe I have with Cyberpunk is that some of the missions, specifically the Delamain missions, feel like they're mocking the Cyberpunk genre. Some of them are interesting. Yeah, a car has AI. AI has gone rogue. This is a big theme in Cyberpunk. We see it in Ex Machina. You see it in Blade Runner. But it's just not done well in Cyberpunk. It feels like they're mocking that whole narrative. Which is fine. It's supposed to be a fun side mission. I get that. But the way they did it was just so bad. I did not like the Delamain missions. They frustrated me. Why am I punching pink flamingos for a car? Another big issue with the game that I had is the pacing. It's a race against time narrative, but there's no sense of pressure for racing against time. You know, V occasionally gets crippled by these attacks from the chip with the relic malfunctioning, but they last for like 2 seconds. You can't do anything about them, and then it's over and V's back to normal, jumping around, doing whatever they do. It just doesn't feel like it's actually disabling. And, you know, because of the way that the gameplay is set up, obviously as you go through the game, you get stronger, you have more perks, you can do more things, you can become better at doing things. But because of the race against time, it doesn't fit organically with the gameplay. So there's like weird disconnect at the end of the game when your character is dying, but you're like, but dude, I can jump really far. And also I have blades in my arms. It just doesn't make sense, really. Like a good race against time narrative, or I'm sick and I'm dying narrative, is Red Dead Redemption 2. Does it really well. As the character goes on, character gets sicker. We feel that through the narrative. There's no reflection of that really in Cyberpunk. There's the end part where V starts to get really sick. It feels like it comes out of kind of nowhere because V has been okay functioning with occasional attacks throughout the narrative, and then all of a sudden V's dying and it's like, oh, okay, I guess this is the end. This is the end of the game then. On the flip side, we have some of the high points of the narrative. One of the biggest high points for me was the side quests in the game. Some of the most emotional and touching scenes are in the side quests.
On behalf of the staff of the Independent California Motel, I wish you all sweet dreams.
But this is also a negative because why aren't they in the main story? A lot of them tie into the main story. A lot of them have to do with some of the characters, the main characters in the story, but they're relegated to side missions. The side missions are what add a lot of flavor into the narrative and actually explore some of the themes that the game doesn't really explore well. You know, you have the Chip and In side quest with Johnny, where we get to know more about Johnny. We get to see his development as a character and as a person in the game, which makes the end of the game make more sense when Johnny decides that, you know, he doesn't want to take over V's body. That makes sense in the narrative because in Chip and In, we learn about what he's like and we see him progress as a character. We see him get closer to V. And we see V begin to meld with Johnny a little bit more. The ending doesn't really make sense if you don't play the Chip and In side quest. On top of that, you have side quests that have a lot of Cyberpunk content. Like in Sinnerman, you spend the day with a religious ex-convict who's convinced that if he kills himself, if he crucifies himself in a brain dance, people will watch it and understand what he's going through and become better people because they're experiencing his feelings. But he's being taken advantage of by a corporation who thinks that it can make them a lot of money. And, you know, in this side quest, you have one of the most interesting conversations with Johnny about the implications of what this is.
I feel bad for him.
We could talk in circles, but who cares what we think? What would it change? Corpse will continue to grow rich off his type, and the masses will live on with their pipe dreams.
Corporations don't care about anything but money and greed, which is a main core theme of Cyberpunk in general. But this isn't a side quest. You wouldn't even play this side quest if you didn't know about it. I accidentally ran into it, didn't even know where it was going, but continued on because I wanted to see the story. I would have never experienced it had I not accidentally come across it. In Judy's side quests, we see how Evelyn is like a product to be commodified. She gets treated so terribly and she ends up ending her own life in the grief of this. And we see the implications of how this affects Judy and her friend group and how they try to revolt against the people who have hurt them and end up failing at doing that, really. And the biggest issue with all of these is that they're side quests. You could easily avoid doing all of this and not get any of this good content, which is really the best content and the best narrative storytelling in this game is in the side quests. So if you don't do the side quests, you're never going to know where the gems of the story actually are. Overall, Cyberpunk was a good and fun play. It is an entertaining game. It is not the worst game I've ever played. It is not a terrible story. It has all the basic building blocks of a good Cyberpunk narrative. It's just that they never quite fit together right. There's nothing extraordinarily special about Cyberpunk that makes it stand out from other Cyberpunk narratives. It feels kind of like a half-baked story that was really close to being amazing, but never quite got there.
Goodbye, V. And never stop fighting.